This video describes the vanished 1960s world, when my friends and I kept a motley connection of vehicles, mobile by fair means or foul. The picture shows my grandfather and some of the vehicles he drove before World War One. Unfortunately, our cars were leftovers from the 30s and 40s. Episode 1. Brute Force. Most of our car fixes just required simple tools, some ingenuity and a visit to the local scrapyard. However, occasionally something more aggressive was required. Alan Bagney was one of our friends, and his Citroën Light 15 had an argument with a stone wall. One wing was severely bent and nearly rubbing on the tyre. Citroëns weren't too common in the scrapyards, so this one needed to have its wing bent back. The metal was quite thick, and it was no easy task. Alan lived in a sort of manor house, which had an entry with massive stone pillars. Stuart positioned the Citroën so that most of it was behind one of the pillars and attached his tow rope to a strategic point on the wing. He then attached the other end to the chassis of his Austin 16, leaving plenty of slack. He put the Austin into first, revved the engine and let in the clutch. There was a severe jolt. The Citroën wing apologised for its excursion and returned to its designed position, or near enough anyway. Episode 2. Priming Cups. Sometime before this, Alan had an interesting 1930s Daimler with a 6-cylinder sleeve valve engine, probably a Daimler 20. The sleeve valve engine had been invented by Charles Knight. It produced a smoother, quieter running engine. He tried to interest various American car manufacturers without success, but it was too expensive to manufacture. However, in the UK, Daimler, who concentrated on luxury and were not bothered by the poorer fuel economy, decided to use the sleeve valve principle. The engine had a primitive method of richening the fuel mixture for cold starts. Each cylinder had a priming cup in the cylinder head near the spark plug. One filled these with fuel and then opened the taps to allow the fuel into the cylinder. After closing the taps, one operated the electric starter or used the starting handle. Priming cups were fitted to various American cars until the end of the 1920s, but persisted as standard in several British cars until World War II. It was also possible to buy spark plugs fitted with the cups. Later carburettors had a standard dashboard-operated choke facility to richen the mixture, and virtually all of our cars had this system. Episode 3. Another novel way of richening the mixture. In a previous video, I've described starting a cold car with ether. However, I once had to resort to a more unusual method. It was some time later, and my wife Rosalind and I were starting on a 7,000-mile American road trips down to Key West in Florida and then up into Canada. We'd picked up the car underground in central New York. There was a spiral incline straight into the New York traffic. At that time, I'd never driven a large left-hand drive automatic, a fast learning exercise. The plan was to sleep sometimes in the car and sporadically in cheap motels. The first night we found an isolated, disused drive-in movie park. In the morning it was cold and the car wouldn't start. It only had about 1,000 miles on the clock, so the battery was good. I could tell that the mixture was lean and it needed a choke, but there seemed to be no way to engage it. This was long before mobile phones, and we were in danger of flattening the battery in useless starting attempts. I opened the bonnet, hoping to engage the choke manually, but this was no Austin 16. There was an air conditioner and a maze of pipes. I couldn't find the choke, but the air cleaner was prominent, so I put my coat over it to restrict the airflow. Rosalind pressed the starter, and to our relief the engine roared into life. Later I found a phone and rang the car hire company. It turned out that for cars of that era, it was simply a matter of putting the accelerator to the floor to engage the choke before starting. We had no further trouble. Episode 4. The Timing Chain Bodge. This is one of the atrocious class fixes. I was using the wonky wing Austin 16 when the timing suddenly seemed off. The distributor was secure, but investigation led me to think that the timing chain was so slack that it had jumped a tooth. As a temporary solution, I slackened off the distributor and rotated it a few degrees. This worked okay, but a week later there was another timing jump. I had to change the timing chain before a jump resulted in the valves hitting the piston. It was winter. We were going through a wet period, and I had nowhere to work under cover. I slackened off the timing cover and could see that the chain was duplex. Using some screwdrivers, I managed to break the chain apart and remove it. The manual said that to fit a new endless chain, I would have to remove both sprockets. I didn't fancy going through all that procedure in the rain, and thought of a crude alternative. Among bits and pieces inherited from my grandfather was a length of single chain of the same pitch and some split links. There was also a tool for removing a link, so shortening it was not a problem. Surprisingly, it fitted, and after aligning the sprockets for timing, I was able to spring a link on. This lasted the rest of the time I had the car. Years later, when on a road trip to the USSR in a Ford Sierra Estate, sometimes I could only get very low-grade petrol. This caused the engine to pink badly. I used the same trick of marking the position of the distributor and then rotating it a bit to retard the ignition. This worked okay. Cars were so much simpler in those pre-computer days. Once when driving through a mountainous region in an Austin minivan, the altitude made the mixture too weak. But the car had an SU carburetor. It was simply a matter of lowering the needle valve jet a bit. Part 3 in the diagram. Nowadays on some cars, a dealer can charge up to £1,000 simply to change a light bulb. Over the years I've worked on several Series 2A Land Rovers, but they were just like Meccano, and a bumper really was a bumper. The modern Range Rover is a nightmare. No wonder insurance costs have gone through the roof. Episode 5. Margarine comes to the rescue. Once we were driving through France in a minivan, a squeak developed in the suspension. It rapidly became so bad that people were turning round in the street to see what was coming. On examining the situation, I discovered that a plastic cup had broken and fallen out. This had left two dry steel surfaces rubbing together. Some grease would have provided a solution, but I didn't have any with me. However, I did have some margarine. I forced a suitable dollop into the joint, and voila, the problem disappeared. When we got home, I had a better look. Both surfaces were badly scored, so fitting a new plastic cup would be useless. It would soon be broken. I drilled and tapped a hole in the outer part and fitted a grease nipple. This proved to be a permanent solution. Episode 6. A Morris 8 Saloon. This is a story of the times. In 1960, John Penwarden and I were standing by the gate of the student hostel. A Morris 8 saloon approached from the direction of the Winter Gardens. In it were two schoolgirls. The driver was sitting bolt upright. Both girls were laughing, but I particularly noticed the driver. It was hardly a coincidence that they had chosen to drive past the hostel full of boys. "Who's that?" I said to my friend. "She's Rosalind Carter. She worked down at the Winter Gardens during the school holidays," was the reply. It was not until 1963 that I met her and she became my girlfriend. It was then that I learned that the other girl was Pat Wyman, who later married Stuart Thornley, my flatmate, and I heard more about the Morris 8. Rosalind had earned sufficient money at the Winter Garden to buy the second-hand Morris. Although she had free tickets for the bus, more than once Rosalind drove her car to school and parked it in a square nearby. However, the headmistress got to hear about it. It had never before happened that a girl had the audacity to drive to school. Rosalind was told to go to her office. "What if everybody drove to school?" was the headmistress's open remark. Rosalind was used to speaking her mind and said that that was ridiculous, since she was the only one with a driving licence and the only one to own a car. This was not the submissive reply that the head expected. She was very angry and said that Rosalind would have to leave. The original plan was that Rosalind would study for S-levels. However, with 3 good A-levels, she could have gone directly to university. But that's not what happened. Her father persuaded her to go to a college of technology in London. Rosalind liked London, but not the college. She was soon back in Malvern, and that was when I met her. After a temporary job at the swimming pool, she got an interesting post at the Royal Radar Establishment, RRE, working on thin-film microcircuits. In later life, she got a first in mathematics and another degree in art history and philosophy. Episode 7. The Corgi Motorbike. One of the guys at the college was Dave Goody. He was very clever, and when he left RRE, he got the highest salary. His final year project just happened to match what a particular company was working on. Our paths first crossed when in the second year he gave me a lift to college on his Corgi motorbike. I said motorbike, but it had a certain resemblance to a child's scooter. During World War II, known as the well bike, they were fitted into a container and dropped by parachute. Stuart had owned one, but David souped up his with a piston of his own design and construction. It also unusually had been fitted with a second seat. Dave was not a small guy, and the two of us on the Corgi looked ridiculous. He next graduated to a Triumph Tiger 110. It was not in the condition of this photo, but it went well. I had a ride on that one too, and Stuart nearly wrote it off going too fast on Jubilee Drive. This Jubilee Drive was part of the circuit around the hills. I nearly bought it there when I came round the corner at speed to find a sightseer had drifted onto my side of the road. Unable to slow down in time, I had to overtake it on the wrong side. Episode 8. A Sad Story. At the time of this story, David bought a 1937 Rover. He was a perfectionist and had the block rebored and fitted with new pistons and rings. It was my third year, and we were both living in Abbotsfield on the other side of the road to the hostel. He worked on the car in a yard behind. He ground in the valves, adjusted the tappets, and was at the final stage of putting on the rocker box cover. This diagram is for an Austin 16, but it was very similar. The two dome nuts should be fitted finger tight. However, in a moment of inattention, he had over-tightened one with a spanner. There was a sharp crack. Part of the cylinder head had fractured, and we could hear water googling down and gurgling into the engine. Dave flung down the spanner and went charging around the yard, swearing at the top of his voice. It was heartbreaking. The only solution was to find a replacement head in a scrapyard, grind in the valves and reassemble. But there were not so many 1937 Rovers around as Austin 16s. However, he did eventually find one. Episode 9. The Unusual Sunbeam. One guy at the hostel was Peter Bromley Barrett. He had a Sunbeam motorbike. This particular Sunbeam was unique. His father was a skilled engineer and had amazingly converted the bike to fuel injection. One day I was talking to him and mentioned my girlfriend Rosalind's name. "Not Rosalind Carter. She's a funny girl," was his comment. I later asked Rosalind about him. Apparently, before I met her, he'd escorted her home after a dance at the Winter Gardens. Bromley Barrett was rather formal and correct, and Rosalind was in a mischievous mood. She acted up and teased him. The phrase, "Not Rosalind Carter, she's a funny girl," has entered our vocabulary and frequently gets quoted. Episode 10. The Car That Didn't Like the Rain. Another friend, Brian Flinton, had a 1935 Rover 12 Sportsman's Saloon. Although the body was aluminium, the rear inner wings were steel. These wings had rusted to the point that there were large holes. If you sat in the back, you had a good view of the spinning wheels. As you can imagine, wet days were a problem. At one stage, he replaced the gearbox with one from a scrapyard. This was a different model, and when we came to refit the prop shaft, it was too long. He sawed off part of the central tube and welded the remaining parts together in the college workshop. The kingpins were badly worn, and an MOT failure for sure. However, he had a solution. Just before the test, he removed them and centre punched them all over. This removed the play and lasted long enough for the test. Episode 11. A Cautionary Tale. One evening I needed to park the Wonky Wing Austin in a rather insalubrious area. Afraid of it being stolen for joyriding, I decided to immobilise it. Normally in such situations I would remove the rotor arm, but for some reason I decided that swapping around some of the ignition leads would be a good alternative. In the morning I'd forgotten this, and for once, having a reasonable battery, pressed the starter button. There was a violent backfire. It turned out that the engine had driven the starter motor pinion hard up against the end of its travel and jammed it. I had to take the starter motor off to free it. Episode 12. Three-wheelers. There were several three-wheeler cars at the hostel. I remember 2 Morgans. That was not surprising since they were built in Malvern. One had a matchless engine and the other one was powered by a JAP or JAP. Stuart had a third chair in a BSA three-wheeler. This is the same company that made guns and included them in its logo. Three-wheelers were popular in the 1930s. They were cheap to buy and had reduced road tax. However, amongst the students they had a reputation for accidents. Episode 13. Speeding. We discovered that the police had been issued with some early speed detecting radar. Since we were students at the Royal Radar establishment, we considered this a bit of a challenge. There was no commercial radar detector, so we set about designing one. Soon a unit was produced which would run off a car battery, and we were ready to test it. The first traffic radars didn't take a photo. One officer operated the radar and radioed to the other the number of the offending car. This was then stopped further up the road. We had discovered where a speed trap was going to be tested, so we bundled ourselves into a car with the new electronics gizmo and drove to the site. Parked up half a mile before the speed trap, we turned on the receiver to pick up the radar beam. We tried for a while without success. However, we were not uninformed. Several of us had been interested in amateur radio and had surplus World War II radio equipment. In those days, police radio wasn't encrypted and was easy to pick up. We heard them reporting that there was so much interference that they might as well pack up and go home. After a couple of months, radar detectors came on the open market, but not from us. However, we never again came across radar traps in the local area. The father of one of the girls we knew was in the police, and unsuspected by her father, would pass on unguarded bits of useful information regarding locations of speed monitoring. Unfortunately, she fell out with her boyfriend, and that source dried up. Our places for speed trials were the Garford Straight, or to Worcester and back, or a circuit of the Malvern Hills. On one occasion I did get caught for speeding on the Greaves. I hadn't noticed the police car, but in those days the fine was nominal and points on your licence had not been introduced. Talking of World War II radio equipment, a couple of us had 19 sets. This was a tank transmitter receiver. We set up an illegal radio link between the Parkview Hostel and Abbotsfield. However, we soon found we didn't have much to say, and given the risk of being caught and the possibility of a severe penalty, we terminated it. Episode 14. Tools and spare parts. Stuart always carried a plank with a vice on it. Using 2 G-clamps, he could make a rudimentary workbench for roadside repairs. He also carried a lot of tools and spare parts: hammers, spanners, a saw, soldering iron materials, brazing materials, a drill, and many others, including a hub puller. I also carried a lot of tools, but not as many as Stuart. However, I did carry a lot of spare parts and raw materials. In my second Austin 16, I had lots of parts salvaged from the wonky wing Austin. These included the generator, the coil, the carburetor, the distributor, the rotor arm in case one got stolen, and the cylinder head, complete with its ground-in valves. My raw materials included Heinz bean tins, lots of jubilee clips, pieces of Dexion, which is a sort of large Meccano, etc. Those who have watched my video Topolino to Istanbul will have seen how this approach got us there. Episode 15. The indispensable jubilee clip. Jubilee clips were indispensable and often used for applications other than securing coolant hoses. Exhaust pipes could be repaired by wrapping a hole or break with baked beans tin and securing it with a couple of clips. Stuart at one time had a French 2CV. The suspension was rather novel and had a cylinder with springs in it. For time to time this needed lubrication. The recommended approach was to force in oil through one of the rubber sleeves at the ends. This was difficult, so he came up with a better solution and drilled a small hole in the top of the tube. It was then easy to squirt oil in. The hole could be closed with a small piece of rubber from an old inner tube held in place with a jubilee clip. Halfway up a Yugoslavian mountain in our Fiat Topolino, a nut holding a pipe to the bottom of the petrol tank fractured due to vibration. It was an emergency, but I was able to draw the crack together with a small jubilee clip. It is described in my video Topolino to Istanbul. Areas that often required attention. Episode 16. Tyres. Steel reinforced radial tyres didn't come into general use until the 1970s. Tubeless tyres were available in the 60s, but we used cross-ply tyres with separate inner tubes. The cross-ply tyres had a canvas base. There were 4 sources of tyres: new, remoulds, retreads, and part worn from scrapyards. For the Venom Clubman, I replaced the tyres with brand new ones of the recommended type immediately after I bought it. But for the old cars it was different. Sometimes we wore them down until the canvas was showing. We then replaced them with scrapyard ones. In fact, we rarely replaced anything on the cars unless it actually broke down, or was just about to do so. Nothing was ever bought new. The local scrapyards were our Aladdin's cave. Years later, when halfway through a long alpine tunnel, we suddenly developed a serious bumping sound. We reached the end of the tunnel okay, but discovered there was a large bulge on the remold tyre. The new rubber had separated from the casing. Episode 17. Radiators. There were 2 problems with radiators: leaking or poor flow. It is possible to have both at the same time. For leaking, some of the students said egg white did the trick, but we thought it might block the tubes, so tried a solution called Radweld. In our experience, it reduced the leakage, but regular topping up and adding more Radweld was still necessary. We discovered no solution to poor flow. Once, encouraged by the promise of limescale removal and their slogan, "cleans round the bend," I tried Harpic lavatory cleaner. It didn't work. The only thing to do was to visit a scrapyard and try to find a better radiator. This required disconnecting the bottom hose and pouring a couple of gallons of water through it as a test. The scrapyard would give a discount if you returned the blocked one. For Austin 16, the swap over only took about 10 minutes, so it could be done on site. Even a slightly leaking radiator was a problem in the winter. It made it too expensive to use antifreeze. In freezing weather, one had to run the water out in the evening and then replace it in the morning. Very tedious. A guy Stewart knew had allowed the water to freeze, and after the thaw, the water all ran out. The owner thought that the block was cracked and sold the car to Stewart for a nominal sum. However, Stewart discovered that the ice had just forced out some lead expansion plugs. He hammered them in, and soon the car was on the road again. The original owner was not too pleased, so Stewart allowed a deal reversal. Other cars had domed steel core plugs that the ice could push out, but neither of these devices could be relied upon. There is a description of making a very difficult repair to a radiator in my Topolino to Istanbul video. Episode 18. Exhausts. It never occurred to us to buy a new exhaust. Temporary repairs were done with bean stins and jubilee clips. If a more serious repair was needed, we visited a scrapyard and examined the vehicles. We would cut out a section or even a whole system. It didn't matter what car it was, it could always be made to fit. In extremis, there were welding facilities at the college. Episode 19. Batteries. These were always a problem. New ones were too expensive for us, and scrapyard ones were a pig in a poke. This meant that the starter motor could rarely be used, and bumping or using the starting handle was obligatory. Episode 20. Acquired skills. Grinding valves in, riveting replacement linings onto brake shoes, replacing corroded headlight reflectors, sometimes bodging in ones from a different make of car, adjusting tappets, fixing clutches, swapping axles and gearboxes, and fixing electrics. As the MOT test approached, steering and brakes were the priority items. Episode 21. Journeys. We didn't let the state of our vehicles deter us from our travels. We relied on always finding a fix to continue. Only once did I not make it. That was when I broke a half shaft in the Vauxhall Wyvern 100 miles from home. Even then I considered jamming the pinion gears in the differential with a suitably placed nut and bolt, and continuing with only one powered rear wheel. However, hitchhiking and then returning with a replacement axle seemed the better solution. We travelled to Scotland, North Wales, London, Cornwall, South Wales, etc. There were trips for climbing and caving visits, to jazz clubs, folk clubs, stock car races, hill climbs, etc. We slept in tents, farmers' barns, churches, on beaches, and once two of us had to spend the night in a telephone box. On one trip we climbed over a fence in the pitch dark and put up our tent. In the middle of the night there was a loud clang, and then a frightening rushing noise that got louder and louder. We discovered that we put up the tent only feet from a railway line and beneath a large semaphore signal. Roadside fixes I've not already mentioned, including driving back from somewhere in a Volkswagen van, using a mole grip to replace the broken off steering column gear change, finishing a journey with only second gear available, using a radio suppressor capacitor as a get-you-home solution to a failed distributor capacitor, driving a Land Rover home on the front axle when a rear half shaft snapped. Occasionally, pre-journey care was taken. One such trip was an excursion to the Isle of Skye. More than one Austin 16 was available, so they were assembled at our friend Tony's parents' home, and the best parts were swapped to the expedition vehicle. The result was a faultless trip. Episode 22. An Afghan fix. This is a bodge that I saw in Afghanistan, but it deserves a place in the Bodgers Hall of Fame. The guy was squatting on the ground with a large truck crankcase in front of him. There was a crack between two of the cylinders. Without hesitation he started to drill a hole about midway along the crack. After about 1.25 inches he cut a thread in the hole. I looked at the tap. It was old and worn, and probably that was the secret, since it would have cut an undersized hole. He picked up a bolt, dipped it in some goo, and then spanned it into the hole. It was a tight fit. Next he cut off the top of the bolt and filed it flush with the top of the crankcase. Job done. There was a guy there who spoke some English. "Has he done that before?" I asked. He looked surprised and said, "Of course." There are lots of fascinating repairs being carried out in primitive Pakistani facilities on YouTube. Episode 23. Other student cars. These included a Lancia Aprilia, an Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire, a Ford V8 Pilot, a Triumph Mayflower, a Standard Vanguard, and a Morris 8 Coupe. Motorbikes included an Ariel Square 4, a Tiger Cub, an Ariel Arrow, and others I can't remember. Not all of our friends' cars were on their last legs. One guy had a smart TVR sports car. He claimed to have taken the young actress Hayley Mills for a ride in it. She must have been about 16 at the time. Paul Burbage had a 500cc Vincent Comet. This was a quality machine. Unkindly, some students referred to it as half a Vincent. No one had the 1000cc twin version. Stuart remembers that when we started at the RE hostel in 1959, there was a strange motorcycle in a shed at the back. It had a 4-cylinder side-valve Austin 7 engine. The rare Bruff BS4 had a modified Austin 7 engine. It used the Austin gearbox and a central drive shaft to power 2 rear wheels. Since these wheels were less than 24 inches apart, it was classed as a motorcycle, not a tricycle. This would have been noticeable, and only 10 were ever made, so it was probably a special of some kind. Numbers of specials were built in the 1930s. Either way, it will be valuable today. This is the end of part 3 and the finish of this series.